Endowment for the Humanities, the BYU College of Humanities, and the Department of English. And we want to thank them. We want to thank the library for giving us this excellent space for the reading. And we also want to thank Becky Farron, who is the major force behind the organization of every reading and does a lot of work and is always in the background. And we really appreciate her and her work. I have the good fortune to introduce Peter Makuck. We're very fortunate to have him as our guest reader today. He's an accomplished writer and a longtime friend of Brigham Young University. Leslie Norris, our distinguished writer-in-residence, introduced us to Peter by inviting him here as a visiting professor, much to the benefit of our writing community and our students. As many of you know, Peter has taught at BYU twice, first during the entire 1990-91 academic year and winter semester 2 years ago. During his residence here, we came to know him not only as a superb writer and teacher, but also as an excellent skier, a mean tennis player, an avid hiker and bird watcher, a great humorist, and a wonderful human being who goes out of his way to help colleagues and students. The same qualities of intelligence, grace, and kindness are shared by his equally extraordinary wife, Phyllis. Some of the interesting things about Peter are that the ocean is his native landscape. He owns a fishing boat and likes to fish in the Gulf Stream off the coast of North Carolina. He and Phyllis live on Bogue Bank, one of the North Carolina barrier islands, and Peter travels to Greenville each week, where he is a professor at East Carolina University. At East Carolina, Peter has been chosen the Distinguished Professor of the College of Arts and Sciences, the college's highest honor. He is also distinguished by the fact that Garrison Keillor of NPR's Prairie Home Companion read Peter's poem Catlight on the radio on NPR. In 1974, Peter was a Fulbright exchange professor at the Université de Savoie, Chambéry, France. Peter Makuck is a gifted writer in many genres. His essay, The Trouble with Smitty, about guns, was chosen for the 2000 volume of Best American Essays. Peter has published 5 collections of poetry and served as the editor of Tar River Poetry since 1978. He is currently preparing the 25th anniversary edition of the journal. He's been its editor for 25 years. Indeed, I have thought of him primarily as a poet, a very accomplished poet who writes wonderful poems himself and chooses strong and compelling poetry for the journal. I would like to quote from the poem A Sense of the Other Side to introduce you to his poetry. A sense of the other side. Back home at last, after seeing my mother lowered into the frozen earth, I couldn't find sleep with wine or even pills, when our calico, as if called, came to the sofa and did something never repeated since. One soft foot at a time, she climbed on my chest, looked through the blank lid of my face, made the faintest cry, then curled over my heart and slept, so that I could, for 3 nights in a row, visitations like belief, unreal, against all odds. I love that poem. As you can see from this poem, Peter's poetry is rooted in experience. The incident, in A Sense of the Other Side, really happened to him, and then crafted skillfully in taut and compelling language and imagery that embodies by the end of almost every poem our relationship to each other or the world and our moral responsibilities to both. Which brings us to his fiction, and specifically to his new collection of stories, Costly Habits, published, that's right here, published last year by University of Missouri Press. These are wonderful stories. As one reviewer said, stories for adults. The individual stories were originally published in such first-tier journals as Yale Review, the Southern Review, Ohio Review, and Hudson Review. And the collection has been nominated for a Penn-Faulkner Award and honored as one of the best 10 collections of 2002 by the Dictionary of Literary Biography. The The stories are subtle and artistic, using the experiences of everyday life, television news, a trip to the hardware store, dinner at an upscale restaurant, to echo and intensify the tensions in the characters' lives. The stories make particularly effective use of setting. A pier jutting into the ocean of the North Carolina beaches, the Arizona desert, even the compression of the cabin of a jet airplane are not merely symbols, but actual aspects of the conflict. Even more important, these stories explore human failing in such ways to suggest that we are capable of realizing how we are flawed and then trying to do better. In other words, they are moral stories. Last night at dinner, Peter said, to echo Flannery O'Connor, there are many ways in which a character can come into his true country. And I believe that characters can enter that true country and survive the experience. They don't necessarily have to die. He also said, it is a risky thing to write because when you put your work out for readers, you expose parts of yourself. As we listen to Peter Makuck today, I think we will be exposed to his depth, significance, humor, kindness, and generosity of spirit. And let's welcome him now.
Thank you very much, Susan. That was a lovely introduction, hands down the best I have ever received. The problem now is how to live up to it. It's wonderful being back here at Brigham Young this morning when I was walking across the lobby in the Marriott. I was called by name and I turned around and a fellow said, Peter, didn't you live at the Residence Inn 2 years ago when you were at BYU? And I said, yes. And I started recognizing his face. He says, I'm Ron. And he used to manage the places. So I sort of like I was coming back home again. And it's wonderful to be recognized by somebody that you once knew a few years ago. It's also wonderful to see familiar faces of friends and former students and colleagues here. I'm going to begin by reading a story from my new book, Costly Habits. It's called Simple Misalignment. And I think the only thing that you need to know about it is that there's a reference, a generational reference to the old Groucho Marx television program. Before the quiz program began, Groucho established a secret word, and if one of the contestants during the program uttered the secret word, down came the duck with a check in its mouth and for the payoff. Somebody told me that that wasn't a readily recognizable reference, and I had better explain it, so I just have. I run every day. My ex told friends nothing could stop me. Thanks to Gore-Tex, not even the rain. Jogging is good for certain problems. For the past week, I've been running longer distances. I escape completely or become absorbed with the whys, make decisions. My usual circuit ends at the Safeway parking lot. I stretch out, cool down, and sometimes grab a Diet Coke for the walk back. Today it's close to 90 degrees, but clouds are on the build, blue-black. And rain might bring back down the temperature. Slowly, not like this wicked quick change flash from the Arctic Safeway air. A cold drink is all I want, but once in the aisles I'm reminded of needs. I'm considering a box of Cheerios when somebody says, hey, Tonto, long time no see. Chuck. For 6 years we taught at the same high school. Chuck quit after his divorce. A former tackle, well-tanned, twin mirrors for eyes. He has gone through lots of changes. His weight is down and he wears a kind of youthful look that almost says, I think I'll grab a few rays. What's with the beard and shades, I ask. Chuck is 6'4" and looks down. The only alternative to death, amigo, is change. Been watching talk shows, huh? I'm into nutrition, he says. I think of the old Groucho Marx show and tell myself, an audience of one, cliches will sooner or later lead to the secret word, bottom line. It will only be a matter of minutes before the duck descends. A hefty polyester woman clashes her cart into a display stack of Pringles and sends tubes rolling in the aisle. Chuck snuffs. She's probably strung out on caffeine or sugar. I ask why I haven't seen him on a tennis court lately. He puts his palm to the small of his back and produces a wince. Had to lay off. Doctor's orders. Maybe a year, maybe for good. Really? Better believe it, man. If you were smart, you'd lay off too. Why, I ask. Lateral movement, he says. So? Worst thing in the world for the spine. A young woman with lovely face and delightful proportions maneuvers her cart past us. She is wearing white shorts and a blue Franzless t-shirt. I say, Franz, that old Hungarian, seems to be smiling. You wonder what he has at the back of his mind. Smoking, Chuck says. He hisses it. See? Look, she's smoking. I almost punched out the smoker at the Wendy's salad bar the other day. My goosebumps are mountainous. I have to move, improve my circulation before I get frostbite. He follows and tells me about inconsiderate smokers poisoning everyone else's air. Let me share something with you, he says. Share. I can almost hear the quack of Groucho's duck. Okay, share, I say. You're really going to eat that yogurt? Why not, I ask. It makes too much it makes mucus, too much mucus. Your cilia drown in that crap. They can't do their filtering number, never mind the cholesterol. I ask what he wants to share, if that's what he wants to share. No, I was going to tell you about smoke. I used to go into bars for socialization purposes, and socialization, I interrupt, you mean to pick up women? He frowns, shakes his head. I vanish and reappear several times in the mirror lenses. Okay, to meet women, he says. Anyway, no more. Too much smoke. All the studies say you might as well be smoking yourself. But Chuck, weren't you a Marlboro man, I asked? This is true. Then I went to this guy about my back. I quit. He gave me confidence in myself. Smoking cessation techniques, plus hypnosis and acupuncture. Man, I went the whole detox route. No more substances. Did you go to an orthopedic man, I asked? His mouth winces as if tasting diesel fuel. He says, well, at first I did, but those guys are a joke. They go after symptoms, never treat his mouth rounds like a choir boy's when he says it, the whole person. Chuck is eating some kind of seeds, shaking them in his fist like a crap shooter. Do me a favor, he says, get rid of that yogurt and try some of these. Here. I ask what they are. Don't worry, they're not peanuts. Peanuts will kill you. Read the studies. Farmers use all these pesticides for nematodes. You want nuts that come out of trees. Nuts that come out of trees. Thanks, I say. I just ran 6 miles. I want something to drink. Ever try papaya juice? Really good for you. I start walking again. Hey, I just want to share some information with you. Share, that's what it's all about. You still mad about the psycho? When Chuck was still at the high school, he coached baseball and worked as a guidance counselor. The year of his resignation, he put a number of outpatients from a state mental hospital into the select classes without alerting the teachers in question on the grounds that they might object or not teach in a normal way. Mainstreaming was the thing. One of Chuck's experiments, hey, life's an experiment, right? Turned up in my class, acted goofy, and I lost control. There was a horrible scuffle when I finally had to eject him physically from the room. Chuck says, hey, the kid didn't weigh 100 pounds soaking wet. Sure, I say, but crazy has something like a wind chill factor with it. He laughs. You handled it okay. If I was still into substances, I'd buy, but I'll make it up to you. Hey, I've got something I want to show you later. Anxious for another topic, I asked about how his private counseling service was going. He makes a so-so gesture with his big mitt. Things take time. A little marriage and divorce work, but Amway is saving him. And somehow I feel saved by a fat man in Bermuda shorts who slips past eating a big candy bar with a yellow wrapper. He looks back at us sheepishly. Chuck says, the guy's begging for a coronary, but then turns the guns on me. He tells me I have deep frown lines. I'm squinting, look pale. Do I know that I look hypertense? Probably too much sodium and not enough vitamin C. I get plenty of sunshine, I say. And plenty of salt, he says. His tone is accusing. He has me. I love salt. Let me show you something, says Chuck. We go up the center aisle toward the last section where the vegetables are. And there at the entrance to the vegetable Eden is the angel in the Franzless t-shirt. Cigarette between forked fingers, she is doing a few steps to an upbeat tune on the house muzak, ready to choose between joy and calgonite. lovely caramel skin and hair that is long and the color of honey. She is wearing a half smile and seems to give me a look. As we idled past, Chuck is going on about lactic acid and blood sugar. You have no idea the kind of things a body craves, he says. True, I say, looking at her, and know that when I get back to my apartment, I'll put on the famous B minor sonata, lie down and close my eyes. Still smoking, says Chuck in disgust. The last aisle in the store is fruits and vegetables, coolers and crispers on both sides, bins for less perishable things in the center. Look at this, says Chuck. He moves among the bins, hovering, hefting cabbage and heads of endive, talking up the benefits of broccoli, asparagus, good for the kidneys, spinach, Popeye knew a good thing, and you should eat them raw and make concoctions in your blender. He holds a big cauliflower in his palm and looks down thoughtfully as if addressing the skull of Yorick. I'm about ready to do it, he says. What, I ask? So many other people in the store are eating, I suspect for a moment he intends to devour the cauliflower amidst all this garden color he is so intoxicated by. I'm going vegetarian, he says. I nod, cock an ear, and look up for Groucho's duck. Not all at once, he says. Taper off, clean myself out. Once you're off it, you can smell meat eaters. I must smell pretty bad, I say. He ignores me. Like, once you've kicked meat, you can feel more in touch with your body. You can almost hear your organs talking to each other. You know what I mean? I can imagine, I say. Once I was off it for a while and got myself in a situation where I ate meat just to be polite. Next time, no compromise. Chuck, I say, this is how fanatical religions start. Next thing, it's eating codes and laws, 2 years at hard labor for chicken livers, the death penalty for pork chops, and so on. He shakes his head, drops the cauliflower, and gives me his best disgusted look. I ask if there aren't certain essentials that you can't sufficiently get from anything but meat. He shakes his head knowingly. I've researched this thoroughly, he says. I've heard that your quantum of wantum declines, I say. If we were in high school, he said, that might be funny. I agree, this is no laughing matter. My neck muscles are becoming tight. He looks me over and asks me to turn sideways. For some reason, I do. He makes a blade of his hand, puts it to his nose and squints, a kind of vertical salute. His diagnosis, I have a slouch. How old are you? Chuck, we were in 6th grade together, remember? He describes a set of symptoms and asks if any apply to me. I hate to admit it, but most do. Go like this, he says. Go like this, he says, extending his arms and touching his palms together. I look around. This chilly garden of fallen vegetables is deserted. Don't be so uptight, he says. Good, that's it. See? Your left arm is 3 inches shorter than your right arm. You get stiffness in your lower back, right? He's got me. My back is giving me trouble. He feels my neck and slides a thumb and forefinger down my spine. You've probably got, he says, a vertebral subluxation. A what? He repeats it, a vertebral subluxation. Isn't that over in the shampoo aisle next to the herbal essence, I say? Very funny. Hey, it's your back. So you think jogging is bad, I say. Bad? Worst thing in the world. I was preparing for this marathon, doing 12 miles a day before I found myself in traction. Get yourself a 10-speed, I did. Just as good for cardiovascular. What about weights? He stares. Worst thing in the world, huh? Better believe it, man. But how do you keep your gut down? Stay toned, I say. Suddenly, Chuck drops to the floor. I'll show you. These are good for your back, too. Palms under your buns and rock. Great for the stomach. Ball player I know bet me he could do 50 of these. Chuck gets to the floor. Gets off the floor. Never got past 30. Get down, try a few. Still deserted. Nobody has passed through the section. A tier of endive heads in the crisper is the only audience. I get to the floor. Chuck's bearded face hovers above, mouth moving with instructions. I can see myself in his lenses struggling like an upended turtle. I'm straining to get a knee to my chin when the principal secretary, Miss Hooks, looks down at me over her glasses, then disappears. Chuck, now free of the school, makes a remark about the eavesdropping business, just loud enough for her to hear. Wonderful, I say, getting to my feet. Walking toward the checkout, past an old woman talking to a picture on a box of cat food, I see the list lady again and give her a nod. As in commercials, I see us running together along the beach with salt white dunes, glassy breakers, just the two of us, hair fluffy and afloat, and it's suddenly hot again, blanketing heat that is oddly welcome. To be continued just a minute. I've forgotten how dry the air is out here. The big black lake of the parking lot is shimmering with warping curtains of hot air. Chuck is talking about his backman, a performer of miracles he is. But if I'm not too bad off, there is something that might make a trip to this healer unnecessary. The trunk of his old maroon Lincoln pops open. Boxes of running shoes, sweatbands, cans of tennis balls, unstrung tennis and racquetball rackets, and what appears to be dozens of wooden statues bagged in clear plastic. Chuck opens a bag and slides out one of these lathe-rounded hunks of stained wood for my closer inspection. It is a kind of rolling pin, seemingly designed by someone who has been an abuser of substances. Two opposed ebony cones taper toward each other, and at the narrow center are two cinnamon donuts some 2 inches apart. The idea, Chuck explains, is to lie down on top of this spinal aligner, for such is it called, with the donuts on either side of the spinal column. You regulate the pressure by adjusting your weight and roll it to the small of your back, from the small of your back to the neck. They're great, says Chuck. Unless you've got a serious subluxation, you'll feel great with this. $10. $10. I figure if it doesn't help the back, I still have an interesting piece of sculpture. Don't pay me unless you decide to keep it, he says. What are these, I ask. At first, they seem to be half-finished ski boots, 4 or 5 boxes. Big item, says Chuck. Gravity boots. They go like hotcakes. Now, they're good for your back, too. Is that right? Come on. Didn't you see American Gigolo? Now it clicks, and I say yes and see Richard Gere hanging upside down from a beam in his apartment. How do you use these things if you don't happen to live in an apartment with sturdy exposed beams, I ask. You get a doorway gym, says Chuck. He reaches behind the boots and draws out a yard-long silver bar bagged in tough plastic. Ta-da! You tighten it against the door frame and you're in business. Well, $8.95. Hey, for the back it beats jogging. I read an article about it the other day. And the gravity boots, I ask? These are original. Since the movie came out, the market's been flooded with a lot of plastic imitations. Fine, but how much? $79.95. I whistle. Forget it. For you, $65, and that's cost. I ask what happens if you get stuck upside down. Chuck says you just grab your thighs and hand over hand to your ankles. No sweat. It doesn't sound convincing, and for some reason my mind produces that famous picture of poor old Mussolini kicking his heels at heaven. So I decide to stick with the aligner. I put my foot on the bumper of his car and fish a 10 from my running shoe wallet with the Velcro flap. Hey, now that's an item, says Chuck, squatting down to work the flap himself. I ought to get a few. Probably sell like hotcakes, I say. Thankful Chuck ignores my mockery. He says, you don't have to pay me. First, see if it works. I press the 10 into his Docker pocket. Okay, he says. If you got a buddy true and blue, stick him, I say, finishing the old high school adage before he sticks you. And we just stand there looking at each other and laugh like hell, slowly tapering off. If the aligner doesn't work, see Dr. Kahn. He's in the yellow pages. Tell him I sent you. You'll feel like a kid again. Thanks. And try to give up that yogurt, he says. I say I will and walk across the parking lot that exits onto my street, not wanting to look back. The heat is wonderful. I'm sweating again. Once around the corner, I stop at a picket fence tangled with new roses. A side yard mountainous with lilac bushes, white peaks in bloom. The scent is delirious. Between two houses, I can see the parking lot. Chuck's car is still there, the trunk open. A small red sports car next to it. He is talking to the Franz Liszt woman. Her trunk is open too. They are standing close, facing each other. She is looking up. Chuck has taken off his sunglasses. Clouds are eating up the sun, billowing into shapes of cauliflower and eggplant, squash, and fans of celery. Suddenly, I recall his remark about not going into bars anymore because of the smoke. But she is nodding her head and seems to be reaching out to him. She is touching her palms. I'm certain one of her arms is 3 inches shorter than the other. But that's not the problem. The scent of lilac is unbearable, and I back away wondering if Chuck can save her from cigarettes, the world of smoke and fire. A guy in a tan summer suit moves along the shaded sidewalk with a hint of destination in his stride. Newspaper tucked under his arm. He grows small and turns the corner. I'm in no big hurry. As I saunter along, it comes to me that Groucho's duck never descended. So send not to ask for whom the duck quacks. And that's the bottom line. I'm going to move back and forth between some books here. As Susan was saying, I live on Bogue Banks, one of the barrier islands, and like to fish offshore. Sometimes, or often, we leave before the sun comes up around 5:30, and you want to get out there. It's a 2-hour ride, and you want to get out there, by 7:30 or 8 o'clock. But Mother Nature, in the form of fog, doesn't always cooperate, and running the inlet is treacherous. Even with radar, some of the big expensive boats have radar, but they don't even want to try it. You really want to be able to see what you're doing. This is and there's a buoy. One of the last red buoys before you go through the inlet is in front of the marina, and so quite often when boats are waiting for the fog to burn off with the sun, they go around in circles. It's like kind of a strange merry-go-round with all different kinds of boats, from the most expensive to the most ramshackle. Ocean fog. This could still be sleep, the way dream untunes the familiar, dawn-hanging curtains that part, then close upon a glimpse of boats around a red buoy that groans at dangerous moves before the gun in some unlikely regatta. This drifting white does tricks with sound, muffles an emptiness that could have a tanker in no time bearing down on a small boat. But the air enchants, drenched with light that glows like pure wool waiting to ignite into nothing, but not yet, not yet. And boats become trawl doors, dangling, or tuna towers, detached and floating, then disappear, surviving only as sound, the deep gargle of diesels, until they emerge, develop slowly whole around the red groaner again, as if trying to awake to some new version of themselves before fading again. Then the sun, in patches, burns a scene into view, and each antenna, cabin, mast, and boom attaches at last to its proper hull, and each boat in circus procession moves seaward from the bridge. Not a lyrical schooner, but a trawler bleeding rust from its scuppers, a tall black and red tug, a homemade houseboat, Tom and Huck in a skiff, 2 flashy Makos with T-tops, and then fancy's final touch where first shall be last. A huge Hatteras, him and her on the flybridge swaying like Brit royalty on the back of an elephant, and just foolin', lettered in fool's gold on the stern, the fog at last finished with his private Fellini. I do routinely, if we have a good day at the stream, it's nothing to come back with 200 or 300 pounds of fish, and then it's my job to clean them all and get them bagged for the freezer and so on. And people come around and they ask you if you're staking a tuna or filleting a wahoo. Somebody inevitably comments how quickly and easily it seems that you do that. But of course I've done thousands of them easily, but where did you learn how to do that is the question that's asked, and your vanity wants the answer to be, well, I'm just sort of a genius. I taught myself how to do it. But there's always somebody behind whatever it is that you've come to do well. And this poem is an expression of indebtedness for when I first started fishing years ago. This is called Ritual on Indian Pier. The pier was empty, full of wooden groans, the seas high, the onshore drizzle blowing horizontally. I met a guy out here, thin and old, hollow in the temples, a hook scar on his chin, his ghostly face smiling under a shaky lamp. All night we fished, outlasted everyone, through a long lull that broke before dawn with a school of blues. Talk didn't matter, but when it came, his accent was shack poor and hard to read. That morning, at the cleaning table, he noticed my hands had never learned how to use a knife. So he taught by gesture, as if ashamed to speak, spat on the white whetstone and made small circles with a blade, angling the steel, honing an edge without feathers. His black hand would stop mine, guide it in behind the gills to find the bone. Toothless, he'd laugh. Then I'd watch his hand as if by magic, in one motion, flip the fillet and peel off the skin. Sharp knife, do it all, he said, holding the skeletal comb to the X-ray light, our ritual finished by gulls. Tonight, on the stone he made me keep, in exchange for a few beers, I find the right angle, make those same small circles. His whole face smiled. Don't you worry, he said, time ain't nothing, and guided me through every last blue, laughing, covering his mouth, then pursing his lips as if kissing himself or somebody else goodbye. Years ago. He must be dead by now. As I cut these blues, find the bone, and work the knife, his white whetstone stands on the rail against the dark like a marker finely set. I have always liked driving at night, especially long distances. I think that behind the wheel of a car, there comes into being an indefinable yet unmistakable self that exists nowhere else. And all you who drive know what I'm talking about. This isn't road rage. That's the negative side of the self that comes into being behind the wheel. But there's a more positive part of it. And sometimes I think my best thinking is done when I'm driving long distance by myself. Part of this poem is set in France. And there's a word, those of you who don't know French, there's the word sanglier. It means a wild pig or a boar. And etymologically, it's not related to the word sang, which means blood. But that's nonetheless suggested in the context. In France, when I lived in eastern France in the fall, farmers were allowed to kill two. And they would, one of them would be sold to the local pork butcher, and you'd see 3 or 4 of these awesome creatures hanging up in front of the pork butcher's shop, and there would be a little box of sawdust under the snout to catch the whatever drops of blood were left. Back roads by night. A need for it grows. Not the white-knuckle stuff with second-gear rubber, racing for a case of beer, dusting some kid face with a hot Chevy. I mean, that first time I soloed in my father's car, I drove for hours slowly through state forest, a gullet of darkness ribbed out with trees. A deer sprang from my lights, its tail bouncing, waving like a handkerchief off in the dark. Wherever I've lived, I've driven at night. Beach roads in Maine, waves burning white, one-lane bridges, the ridges and hollows of West Virginia. I've got a letter to mail, I'll say, and slip out. Glide on back roads where I'll meet no other cars, roll by darkened houses, safe as graves, and think I'm the only one in the whole county awake. Then eyes ignite green in my lights. A white tail waves. One night in France, in the Alps, a boar, a sanglier stood in the road, all tusk and bristle. I stopped. White peaks gathered behind him. He stood there, carved by my lights, a mad and necessary thought, then ran from the road. I watched him in a small silver field turn, run at the dogs, break through a thicket. Finally, I drove on with those white tusks flashing. Sometimes, for fun, I'll let a radio preacher yell, tell me how easy salvation is, how to get saved. It's as simple as the past tense. You only touch the dial and mail in the tithe to Brother Sid. Tonight, what I need is that boar, the magic of sanglier, a word full of blood. But even as he breaks thickets in the mind, I see the pork butcher, bon bourgeois, string him up, hang him from an ancient hook in front of his shop. He turns slowly in the wind, and into a small box of sawdust under his snout drip the last drops of that wild blood, gone, already absorbed. I have like a few other people that I know, 2-hour drive to work. Some 5 years ago, I moved from the university town down to the coast just in time for a series of hurricanes designed to take the romance out of coastal living. But I could get to the university in an hour and a half if I drove on state highways 43 and 17. Not barring the several speeding tickets I've got, I've decided that I was going to go the back roads because it was slower and it was more pleasant to look at. No advertising, nothing commercial. You're back in a timeless North Carolina. And I usually mid-waist, I have binoculars under the seat of the car in case I see a deer, or once in a while I see a black bear, fox, northern harriers, and I'll stop and look them over with my binoculars. There's also a bridge where I like to stop midway and just sort of stretch. This poem is called Truant. And in some ways, it's hard to believe I still see myself as a truant. Going to school, I still love my teaching and my classes, but I'm a truant in my reluctance to want to be on committees and stuff like that. When the weather is right, this is from my new book, by the way. I've got a book that's coming out probably late next year. Truant. When the weather is right, on the long drive to work, country roads all the way, I stop at a bridge over the Neuse River and walk the span to loosen my legs and neck and check the riverscape changing. 5 minutes might pass before a car does. Last week, an old farmer idled by on a green John Deere. His passing opened a huge quiet. High water chuckled against wooden piers. Mayflies glittered in the sun. And the water top was a black trance until a light blue kayak floated into view below me, a kid with a blaze of blonde hair. He leaned back, paddle across gunnels, blades flashing, his face to the sky, an appraiser on duty. With me, it was a lake, an old town canoe. I'd lie in the bottom, inspect the clouds for shape, color, and size. My first job, to let the wind move me towards some surprise, naming as I went, boot, nose, horsetail. Hey, you okay? It was a county sheriff in a maroon cruiser, a white Stetson shading his face. Did he think I was about to jump? You ain't got any ideas, right? I smiled and shook my head. No ideas, but in things, my smart-ass twin almost said. But whatever ideas I had dissolved into a picture of that boy and the kayak drifting with clouds. I was just looking, I said, just looking, and stepped from the rail toward one more hour at the wheel. When I met my wife about, well, many years ago, I'll put it that way, one of the first things that we had in common, beside a love of literature, was tennis. And we have played tennis all of our lives. In fact, where we live now, there's a tennis court next to the house, not ours, but we can use it whenever we want to. I've been an editor of a poetry magazine for almost 25 years, and you develop certain definite biases over time, and I'm fairly upfront about what it is in poetry that I don't like. One of the things that I've grown to detest. Interested? One of the things I've grown to detest is poems with the word poem in them. Poems about poetry. I hate poems with the word poem in them, unless it happens to be one of my own. I've only written 2 with the word poems in them, so I just want to tell you that. One time, Phyllis said to me, "How come you never write any poems about me?" Now, I want to tell the guys in the audience, when she asks that question, it's not a question. You have just received your marching orders, whether you know it or not. This is called Players. The yellow ball clears the net, skids low. Your racket reaches, flicks, and floats it back. We hit this poem together and watch it shuttle, weave against the green of someone else's youth, the emerald pathos of a dozen different parks. Back and forth, we build a rhythm, increase the pace, then break. With lobs, then steady strokes again, we stretch our rallies past the average player 5. We make each other run, lunge to get what is past us, play off the impossible. We do anything to outwit the average, the space, this space that is nothing without us. Sometimes I take advantage and hit out hard, but you still strain for the save, as if it were something rare, important as marriage. So the ball leaves yellow lines. Once, near the ocean, time did a radiant slow-mo. You raced with your racket extended and the ball towered to a yellow spot in a sky gone suddenly storm green. It hung while you centered in your white dress. White, yellow, storm green, white, the perfect centering. Too excited, I watched my overhead splash the net. Then, as now, we come together at the net, our faces glad with sweat, each telling what the other missed or didn't. I'll read two more poems. One is set in the desert southwest. It takes place around Christmas time. My wife and my father-in-law and I went out to the cemetery about a year after my mother-in-law died to visit her grave. And I don't think the poem needs any other kind of prefatory comment. It's set outside of Phoenix, this cemetery, Santa Cruz. In the low afternoon light, a row of cottonwoods led us out of Santa Cruz, a small cemetery off in the desert. That day, a few days before Christmas, your father in the front seat with me, I kept seeing your mom not there in the back with you, and him as I drove stare through the passing mesquite to some other place perhaps, silence enforcing a distance. Lame, he had held my arm, looked down at the unhealed turf, then crossed himself, thin shoulders quaking. I looked beyond the wall, across the creosote flats, and watched a coyote drag something limp toward a culvert. Back in the car, I kept seeing, tethered to stones, all those mylar balloons, Feliz Navidad or Te Quiero in the shape of a heart, emblems of another culture, telling us how far from home we were, the balloons tormented in desert wind. Before houses rose up and the lights of Phoenix hid a perfect indigo sky where stars began to glimmer, we stopped at a crossroads light. Emptiness everywhere but this rancho of cracked adobe, chickens, and a single goat. In front of the corral, a Mexican sat on a kitchen chair, his face tipped back and bronzed like a mask. We watched a young woman trim his hair, then lean down for a whisper and a kiss, their faces wrinkled with laughter, making me ease the car ahead to center and frame them in an open gate at our side while we waited for the light. Your father turned and watched them too, and though his face was shadows, I saw his features tighten and focus. After the woman ran her fingers through her husband's long dark hair and trimmed again, your father closed his eyes and smiled. Their voices came inside, but they never looked our way as we watched, oblivious as a family photo finished by a boy in a red bandana entering from the right, chasing a black chicken and making it fly. Before we left that crossroads with whatever it was we needed, the light went green 2 or 3 times, I think. The last poem is the title poem of the volume, Against Distance. All you need to know is that on the Carolina coast, there are fishing piers that run along at some 5-7 miles distant from one another, and they stick way out into the ocean. We also have what's called riptides. Every year, swimmers die in these riptides. Last year, the island I live on lost 5 people to riptides. I was caught in one with my son one time and knew what to do. My son, being a teenager and knowing that he was immortal, said, "Hey, Dad, do you know what this is?" And I knew it was a riptide, and I knew that we couldn't do anything until we got far out. That's the idea, is to let yourself be carried along and then swim parallel to the shore. Against distance. It was toward the end of the pier, toward the shark rigs, toward guys cracking beers and jokes where fathers and kids used to fish all day. I heard, then saw, some 40 yards off, a boy in a black tube caught fast in a riptide, waving an arm that couldn't be seen by anyone, it seemed, but me. In a few seconds, I knew, he'd quit the tube and try for shore. So I dove, unable even later to remember dropping my rod and reel, removing sandals or climbing the rail, seeing only the reflected arrow of a body break the surface, my lucky face escaping a web of lines and hooks. I swam toward something remembered, the long shadow of Jack the Greek, my uncle's buddy, breaking through a quicksilver membrane, his face pinched, the arm reaching down to pluck me back into air. I reached the boy with just enough breath to blurt, "Stay with the tube." Then over and over told him not to worry, though I did, because the current was wicked and fast and the pier hurried back and away. Figures at the rail grew small, and none I could see were running for help. The valve stem bubbled hard, and boats I had seen from the pier now disappeared. Though he didn't cry, his chin wrinkled like the stone of a peach. His eyes grew huge, hazel, and round. A small worm scar on his cheek, scarlet from the sun. My pep talk doing little to soften all the taut white lines of his face. The clouds mockingly swam at an easy pace toward the beach. Never had I been so distant from shore, except in a boat, and thought about the reef sharks you often see at the end of the pier. "Don't splash," I said. Besides, kicking was useless. The rip would leave us far out when it quit. The coast at the top of swells showed itself a long white line of sand, a lime-colored band of live oak and yaupon, and the beautiful faces of homes. E.T. was his favorite film. Baseball, his favorite game. His father lived in another town. Mom's under the pier with her friend. Less than an hour ago, I had stood on the porch of our rental, the sky all flickered white and torn with gull cries over an ocean going from gloss to rough, where krill massed and mackerel sickled through on a changing tide toward the pier. I tapped the window, waved my arms, pointed to the action, did a dumb show of reeling like mad, but the kids, enthralled by a video game, were shadowy figures drowning in an air-conditioned room, glassed against the water and sand, with cartoon bombs detonating louder than the surf. No interest in the older game of cast and weight, mackerel flanks all silver flecked with bronze. So off I went with one of the 5 rods I had just rigged toward the long, tall pier in the distance. No one was coming. Moments got longer. Water slapped at the tube. The valve stem bubbled away. And something sinister began. A faraway house, alone on an undeveloped dune, became a face, with wide-apart dormers for eyes, a porch roof nose in between, twin brick chimneys for ears. The face, like some false god, commanded belief, gloated, then fixed us with a sun-struck pane glass eye. For a moment, just for a moment, I was ready to believe, to sacrifice whatever it wanted until we drifted up to a raft of gulls that rose and broke apart like some selfish memory I wanted to forget. An 8th grade nun who knew I'd come to no good end for always laughing at the wrong time, as I did just then, a panicky cackle that frightened the boy, who let go a cry lonely and lost as any I have ever heard. As if his mind, or mine, had snapped, then grew calm as the current. At some point, unnoticed, the wind turned about and came at our backs with a rush. And kicking together, but so as not to splash, we cheered ourselves as the beach, in glimpses at the top of swells, came slowly closer, and that face became a house again. Knots of tiny bathers below it, and lone dark figures bending for shells. We kicked and rested. Shouts and cries came over the surf far from the pier where our far from the pier where our toes touched sand again. Children ran and dove, shellers stooped, but no one arrived to wrap us in blankets or hugs. Unnoticed, we had been swept away. The boy, shaking water, left his tube and splashed from the shallows, ran toward the pier where his mother, and the man who might one day be a father, returned to retrieve that leaky black tube and look about for another man, now hidden above them on the fishing pier. In the afterlife of the cottage front room, I lay on the sofa, trying to focus that other world within this one, wavering its magic light on the ceiling, heavenly proof of the buoyancy still in my limbs, angels laughing around me at sitcoms and game shows, me drifting again, air-conditioned as anyone, thinking of saving and of being saved by a boy who could have been my son and kept me from drowning. Thank you.